The ship hung over the wounded moon like a hunter's knife. Dust in the low gravity did not fall so much as it drifted, each particle carrying its own tiny orbit of grief. The mining camp below had been quiet an hour ago. Roaring furnaces, old songs, a woman laughing somewhere on a catwalk. Now it was all alarms and the hard, flat light of emergency strobes washing the rocks with a heartbeat the planet itself could feel. He moved through it the way humans moved through disaster. Head down, teeth set, a rhythm learned in storms and long winters in cities that burned and rebuilt. His name was Cassian Holt, salvage engineer from the belt, 32 years old, thin as wire and twice as stubborn. His suit showed where years of work had polished the plating to dull satin. The mag boots hit ladder rungs with a ringing that cut across the confusion. He didn't intend to play hero. Heroes were expensive, and he had none of that currency left. The first shot made hot air hiss past his cheek and turned a wall panel into splinters. The second chewed an angry groove through the railing. He grabbed a breath later. They weren't aiming at him. Not really. The raiders were spraying fire at anything that moved as they dropped from the belly of the black cutter above. The camp had nothing to throw back. Too poor for guards, too remote for law. The kind of place pirates fattened on because it kept the galaxy from having to look. He reached the refinery floor, a cavern of suspension bridges and vats that glowed like bottled lightning. People ran, some fell. He didn't look where the beam cutters had opened them. Human memory had no space left for that. He saw instead the small figure trapped on a catwalk that had twisted in a glancing hit. Not human, lavender skin like stormlight hung in water, white hair braided in a cascade down the back of a uniform too new for these kinds of places. A girl, young, he guessed by the roundness of the face, the way her eyes were too wide to have learned cynicism. The insignia on her collar looked old and proud, something from a species with long stories. She was pinned. One of the cataphract pipes had bent through the grate, locking her ankle. She stood at an angle too painful to hold. Her hands shook on the rail. He could have gone the other way. Someone shouted his name. Someone else grabbed his arm and tugged. But when her gaze met his, blue so clear it almost hurt, it was the look from 1,000 years of wars. The one that asked in a voice soft as breath, "Are you the kind that leaves?" He wasn't. He ran, bolts skittering under his boots, and slid the last 2 meters on the catwalk. "Hold still," he said, the words flat and even because fear listened for tremors. He jammed a pry bar under the pipe and leaned, every muscle drawing down to a point. The pipe lifted a centimeter. She gasped. He kept leaning. "Move your foot." She didn't. She stared at him. Understanding wasn't the same language as trust. He grunted, shifted, and then the world broke into shards. A raider slammed boots on the walkway behind him. The man wore a hood with a skull sprayed on it, old human myth, cheap new paint. He raised a stub rifle. Cassian turned, swung the pry bar like it was the only thing left in the universe, and caught the man across the wrists. The rifle spun away and clanged. The second raider hit from the right. Cassian elbowed him in the throat and felt something give. He never heard the third, only the white impact that bucked his body and spun him. A spear of heat became a line of cold. His knees went weak. He lost the pry bar and almost lost the girl too. She made a sound like the start of a word, and then the rest of the shots found them. One slammed into his shoulder and pushed him back against the rail. Another tore through the meat above his hip, and the world narrowed to a tunnel through which he carried himself by stubbornness alone. He had understood disaster before. Now he understood how small a human could be when a weapon decided physics for them. "Don't move," he said, though it sounded like someone else whispering from a far room. He threw his shoulder again into the pipe. It lifted, whining. She yanked her foot free and cried out when the flesh tore. He took her weight as she fell. Something punched him again and again and again, like a giant angry fist saying no. He counted without trying, 1, 2, 3, and somewhere past 4 a part of him marveled at the math of survival. The refinery floor shuddered. Cassian made choices. He chose left where a collapsed bridge made right impossible, chose down in a world that suddenly valued gravity differently, chose this hand over that when blood made both untrustworthy. The girl clung, and he realized she wasn't a child. The depth in her gaze was older than he thought, or maybe age meant something else on her world. The pirates were taking hostages near the lift. He went the other way. It was a blessing and a curse that a man who fixed broken things knew where things would break next. He cut through a maintenance corridor that even the camp's foreman had forgotten, shouldered a door whose lock had been complaining for a decade, and found the emergency sled docked behind an auxiliary intake. The sled was a sheet of metal with a field bubble and a motor that had been pulled from something better. It would get them as far as the boundary ridge. He collapsed on it. The girl tried to right him before she saw that right was no longer an option. "Your name," she said, voice trembling. Her accent turned S to Z, turned hard consonants into a song. "What is your name, human?" "Cassian." He coughed, red flecked inside his visor. "You, Lur." She took a breath like something sharp and set it aside. "Third Vector Cadet Vaeryn Protectorate." "Lur," he repeated. He squinted at the control rune and slapped it. The sled hummed, lifted, and thumped forward. The shock jarred his wounds. He gritted his teeth and tripped the release. They, two small lives in a universe suddenly too big, shot out of the breach and into a canyon of stone cooked blue by the local star. The sled's field hissed as dust grains ricocheted. Behind them the refinery burned and the cutter remained overhead, pulling the last of the usable scrap of a human settlement into its belly. He knew he wouldn't get far. He knew in a background way, the way you know winter is coming by the taste of the air. He felt too light. His fingers tingled. The panel on his wrist that counted heartbeats told a story he didn't want. "Hold pressure," he said to Lur, and took her hands without asking and pressed them hard on the worst of the holes. Her palms were cool and strong. "Don't lift them, no matter what." Her mouth trembled. "You are bleeding out." "That's the thing about bleeding," he said. "It takes time." The canyon's curve hid them for a while. The sled sliced between shadows and sun like a pendulum. Lur watched him, watchful like a creature whose whole world had become this one task. Keep this fragile stranger alive for a few breaths more. "Why did you come back for me?" she asked, whispering like it might break him louder. Cassian thought of the long corridor of his life. The mines, the narrow rooms, his father's hands hard but steady on a child's shoulder. The day he'd signed a contract that had turned planet after planet into a long chain of almost homes. He thought of the look in her eyes. He answered the way practical people answer when the truth is poetry. "Because you were there." She nodded like that made the kind of sense you could hold. The border ridge appeared. Beyond it, the wreck of a Protectorate shuttle lay like a bird that had tried to fly and discovered it had always been stone. Cassian steered for it. The sled bucked as the terrain went ugly. He didn't feel the moment his vision narrowed to a small bright circle. He only felt the whaler's hands tightened and heard the hiccup in his breath. When the sled skidded to a stop beside the shuttle, Lur moved with a competence that surprised him. She half carried him into the shadow of the broken wing. She shouted something in a language that made the rocks vibrate. A panel hissed. A ramp stuttered. She dragged him inside. He looked up and blinked at the ceiling as if it had a sky hidden in it. Lur worked. Cold foam across his chest. Bypass safeties. A hiss that bit his skin. She was too young to know some of these systems, but fear is a kind instructor. He tried to say her name. She leaned close. He lifted a hand. The world trembled, then slid away like a landscape moving past a train window. He woke to wait. Not the weight of gravity or obligation, or the 1,000-story inheritance of a species that had learned to run and keep running. A literal, physical weight pinning him to a flat surface. His first instinct was to fight. Muscles flared and found limits. Pain crowded around those limits like guards. He caught a breath and used it for stillness. The weight shifted but did not lift. Light swam back into his eyes. He found focus and regretted it and then made himself keep it. She was enormous over him. Not grotesque, not monstrous, enormous the way mountains are enormous, the way old oaks are enormous when you stand at their feet. A woman, by the lines of her face and the taut curves of uniform, but not human by a wide margin. Skin the hue of twilight, hair white as new frost, shoulders broad under a military cut, eyes that had burned galaxies into the memories of her ancestors. She straddled him on the narrow medical cot, hands pressed against the field dressing at his chest with relentless precision. He recognized her insignia from the refinery, translated now by a quiet portion of the medic bed's interface. Vaeryn Protectorate Sovereign Guard Commander. She looked at him with a soldier's inspection and the terror of someone who has already lost too many. "Stay," she said, voice low. "You moved, you bled again. Makes sense," he managed. "You were shot 7 times," she said. The number was clinical and furious. "You will not add an 8th by stupidity." He tried to nod and turned it into an eye flick when his neck argued. The room around them was a Protectorate field med unit, humming with quiet machines and the smell of sterilants that all species learn to trust. Someone else moved in the corner, a smaller Vaeryn, armor scuffed, eyes red. The enormous woman didn't wear a name tag. She wore her name the way starships wear their hull numbers. "I am Commander Sarah Zyshaw," she said, as if giving him a handhold on a cliff. "You are Cassian Holt, apparently. You dragged my niece from a refinery being sacked by freeborn corsairs. You were shot 7 times doing it. You delivered her to a crashed shuttle and kept her breathing for 41 minutes while she found the supplies to keep you breathing. You did this without knowing her name, her emblem, or her bloodline." Cassian looked past Sarah at her. The girl stood straighter under his gaze, chin lifting. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," she whispered back. Sarah's pressure never relented. "If you move, human, I will break more of you to keep you alive." He believed her. Then he understood all at once that she wasn't straddling him for dominance or to pin an enemy or anything that would have haunted a lesser story. She was using her mass as leverage. His wound vax worked, but the biggest hole the pirates had put in him was deep and mean and bleeding past the field. Their medicine needed pressure. She had supplied it, and without a pad to kneel on or a second pair of hands, her body became the only tool strong enough and steady enough to replace an operating suite. The ceiling flickered. He turned his head the smallest amount and saw the estimate lines, the math of how much blood he had left to spare. Enough, maybe. If he didn't argue, he settled as best he could into the strange dignity of the moment. A soldier mountain held his life like a bird she refused to drop. A rescued girl watched with eyes that had seen too much in a single day. Somewhere outside, pirates made their plans. Inside, human physiology made its own. The med unit hummed, time crawled. Pain arrived in waves he learned to time. He found the breath between those waves and lived there. After a while, Sarah spoke, not as a commander but as something older. "When I was young," she said, "my sister and I would lie on the top hull and watch cargo lights sweep the night. We promised we would leave our world together. She never did. I left, and I have chased wars and put them down. Today I found her child standing in a storm of fire because a human would not carry his feet the other direction." Cassian worked moisture into his lips. "Glad I didn't know she was a commander's niece. Might have made me nervous." Sarah's mouth did a small, unfamiliar thing that might have been the beginning of a smile if she had not been busy refusing death on his behalf. "You were already nervous," she said. "You just do not know that word for it." They didn't ask each other for promises. They made the only one that mattered by not letting go. When the med unit finally signaled a fragile stability, Sarah eased the pressure in a millimeter's surrender. The wound didn't gush. She exhaled. In another lifetime, that breath would have been a prayer. "We cannot stay," Lur said, composed now in the tidy efficiency of those who have been broken and then gotten up. "The corsairs will sweep for survivors." Sarah glanced at an external cam that showed the black cutter settling toward the ridge like a hawk that had been laughing. "They are not hunting survivors," she said. "They are waiting for something. Us? Lur asked. Someone. Sarah's gaze went back to Cashin. If she weighed the cost of moving him, she hid it from her eyes. Can you stand? Can, he said, because the answer to a question like that is not the same as the truth. They suited him in a med shell that turned him into a carried man within his own skin. He could walk so long as walking meant a series of managed falls. Lur fitted a small exo around his legs and braced his side with a strap that bore the emblem of her protectorate. Sarah remained a step away at every second, her presence an architecture of safety. They left the shuttle through a cut in the rear where the ground had bent the frame. The canyon held its breath. The stars burned as witnesses. The cutter sent down scouts. They moved like men who believed nothing could go wrong because they had done so much wrong already and survived it. Sarah led them across rock, hugging shadow like a second skin. Cashin's breath sounded too loud in his ears. They found other survivors, 2 miners, a cook with a broken arm, and a man who had managed to carry 3 toolboxes through a war. Humans all. They stared at the alien commander and the wounded man and made choices that had more to do with species than language. They fell in next to Sarah and learned like a new kind of squad. They made it to a fissure that chewed down into the planet like a wound that had never closed. The entrance was a slot too narrow for the scout mech. Inside was dark as silt and cold as old secrets. Heat signatures vanished in the stone. Piracy required patience and mathematics. The pirates had won and gambled they didn't need the other. They camped in a cave that had an old miner's shrine in it, scratched names, a rusted hymn pinned under a smooth stone. The survivors knew the song. They didn't sing it. They set a kettle on a coil and watched the steam draw lines in the air. The commander sat near the cave mouth, helmet propped on one knee, watching the line of sky the way weathered leaders do when they count futures. Cashin slept in slices. He woke to Lur's careful hands adjusting the med shell. He slept again and woke to Sarah looking at him with the eyes of someone building a map and adding a new continent where he lay. Hope, she said quietly when Lur went to refill the kettle. It is a shape. You can see it from a distance. The way you carried Lur, some shapes you make with your body so other people can fit inside them. He stared at the cave stone and thought about the simplicity of a thing like that. He thought about how complicated he had been once and how that hadn't saved anyone. Tomorrow, Sarah said, I will go to the cutter. They are waiting for a shuttle that they shot down and did not find. They wait because someone promised them something this shuttle contained. If I remove their waiting, we will have air. Alone? Cashin asked, voice too soft to be as sharp as he wanted. I am not asking. She said, I am telling the shape of the next hour. He tried to sit up. The med shell disagreed. He used his eyes for anger instead. Sarah caught that, weighed it, and nodded like something had been added to her balance. Not alone, she amended. With you, because sometimes hope also needs someone reckless to carry the forward edge. I can walk, he said, because sometimes you build truth by saying it. They moved before dawn. If dawn meant anything on a moon, that counted days differently. The fissure opened onto a scree slope that had a view of the cutter's belly and the gangway bristling with men who had known too many cheap victories. Sarah outlined the plan in a few words. Lur nodded in that way of soldiers who can hold both love and duty without letting either sink them. The plan should have worked, and as is the nature of stories the universe likes to hear, it did and didn't. They cut under the ridge. Sarah took 3 guards with blades that moved like a pinion made steel. Cashin made one fall by being where the man did not expect anything that fragile to be. Lur shot a signal spike into a seam the pirate crew used for fuel. Things fire knows how to do, they did. They were at the top of the gangway when the door hissed and gave them the man who had always been waiting. He wore the ragged coat of a freeborn captain and the smile of someone who believed the galaxy was a thing you could rearrange by wanting. His beard was silver, his eyes were not. Well, he said, looking first at Sarah and then at Cashin as if weighing which of them amused him more. I wondered what would pull the Protectorate dogs to this rock. I did not expect a human who should be a corpse. Sarah didn't answer. Her blade did. He was quick. He didn't move like a man who had grown fat on stealing. He moved like a man who had once believed something and learned to hate it instead. Their fight made space around them. Covered Cassian's left. He found a rail that didn't trust his weight but accepted it. He breathed the way med techs tell you to. The captain fought to retreat, not to win. Cassian saw it, the angle of the body, the focus beyond the blade. He wasn't buying time, he was building it. Bomb, Cassian said, too quietly. Heard anyway. Her attention pinned to the underside of the gangway where a case hummed like the beginning of a song. The captain laughed. Insurance, he said, in case honor shows up. Sarah pressed him. He whistled. The hum became a keen. Cassian didn't have much to throw. He threw himself. He hit the case with both hands and felt the impact travel up the bones he'd managed not to break yet. The case didn't disarm. It pivoted. He heard Lur scream his name, and Sarah called something that felt like both order and plea. He used the tiny tools in his wrist plate and a memory of a different day in a different mine where they'd taught him what vibration meant when it occurred at that frequency. The case went silent. So did the captain's smile. For a heartbeat, the universe drew a breath like a child who had just taken a dare. Then Sarah's blade was at the captain's throat, and Lur's weapon was at his heart, and Cassian was on his knees with the case held against him like a newborn that had tried to explode its own life. "You lose," Sarah said. "Not yet," the captain said, and used the millimeter between victory and its shadow to cut the power to the gangway and drop them toward the rocks. Things slowed the way they do when your life decides to get cinematic. Sarah grabbed Lur's belt and flung her toward the ridge where a jut of support could be a handhold if you believed it enough first. Cassian's med shell locked his joints to keep him from folding wrong. He rolled. The case bit his chest. The opposite side of the world slammed up and introduced itself. He woke to silence again. No weight this time, just the precise soft of his med shell counting successes. Lur's face was above his. Behind her, the ridge was on fire, but it was the kind of fire that ate what the pirates used to breathe. The cutter was listing, damaged systems protesting. Sarah stood on a rock that had been a gangway a few minutes ago. The captain lay at her feet, hands bound behind him. Sarah was bleeding, not badly, but she had the look of people who have decided that pain is noise. She met Cassian's gaze, and because some languages are older than words, everyone in that moment agreed on three things. They would live. They would not be safe, and this was not finished. "Your case," Lur said, breathless. "Can you make it mine?" "Glad to," he said, and handed a bomb to a girl like it was a toy she could take apart and put back together, which is what she did, fingers quick and sure. They left the captain secured to a rock with a transmitter on his ankle that called every authority within range. They took what they needed from the cutter and ran, because victory that tastes like ash is still food. They moved into the canyon and kept moving. That night, with the sky slow strobing from something that had been a ship deciding how to be wreckage, Sarah told the rest of the plan. "The Protectorate patrol will answer," she said, voice low enough to keep the shadows asleep. "But not quickly. We are in the outer wedge. The Freeborn own the quiet here because they made everyone else believe no one loud lived here. We will make noise." "We can hide," the cook said. "We know the folds." Sarah shook her head. "Hiding sustains life, noise changes it." She looked at Cassian when she said the last part. He didn't know why, then he did. "Your people," she said, "have a reputation for endurance. Sometimes we speak of it with respect, sometimes with a hint of fear. You wear your lives like armor and then give that armor away. This is one of those times." He wanted to deflect, but the med shell had made him honest. "What do you need?" "A beacon," she said. "Not a signal, a story. The kind that makes the wrong sort of men afraid to step where a certain kind of human has stood." He almost laughed. "I am not a hero, Commander." "Good," she said. "Heroes are brittle. I want a man who can carry the weight of a thing until it changes shape." They built traps in the canyons, nothing elegant, just engineering that respected gravity. They used the cutters' half-functional drones to scatter false tracks. Lur drew symbols in the dust that made the freeborn hesitate because superstition travels with soldiers the way shadows travel with light. Cassian mapped the flows of air and stone. He had always known where things would break. Now he learned where they wanted to break for him. He lured a scout team into a cul-de-sac where every rattling pebble made them spin in a circle. He stood on a ridge and let them see him. He didn't run. He walked away with the careful slowness of a man who had decided fear could ride on his shoulder for a while if it promised not to hold the reins. Days elongated in the canyon's narrow clock. Sarah slept in snatches. Lur learned the names of the miners and gave them to the rocks to keep safe. The freeborn sent more men and invested less hope in them each time. That was the power of stories. They bend expectation even in those who do not believe. In the time between alarms, Cassian and Lur talked about small things. The taste of the tea her people drank that turned tongues blue. The stubbornness of his mother when the belt storms hit, and she kept the kitchen warm anyway. She told him about the protectorate schools where children learn tactics by designing games that no one could win. He told her about the old Earth films where humans always ran toward the camera when the building collapsed behind them. "You laugh at yourselves," she said, wonderingly. "Helps us remember we're not gods," he said. "You bleed like it," she observed, dry, and tucked another blanket around him because the med shell warmed blood only so far. The day the Protectorate patrol answered, the sky cracked. A spear of blue cut the horizon. The freeborn footed their last bet and lost it badly. Sarah stood like a statue carved from purpose and did not take credit for the dawn, but the dawn bowed to her anyway. The patrol landed in a shower of dust and order. Officers spilled down a ramp, and for a moment the cave's survivors looked small. Cassian watched them straighten one after another like plant stalks found the sun. Sarah made the introductions with the bare minimum of ritual. "This is the man who kept my niece alive and dragged her through fire and then allowed himself to be used as a weight until he could stand and fight again," she said. It was not flowery. It was truer than a poem. The patrol commander, a man with the same eyebrows as Sarah and the exhausted patience of logistics, bowed to Cassian in a protectorate way, palm to heart. "You will come with us," he said, "for debrief, for medical, and for honors." "No honors," Cassian said. "Give those to the people who didn't leave their homes. I was only visiting." Sarah's mouth did that almost smile again. "You will come with us anyway," she said, and this time Cassian didn't argue. They left the moon with the survivors in the patrol's belly. Lur sat beside him in the med bay of a ship that had lived too long to be surprised by anything. He watched the moon shrink and become a wound in the sky that would scar white. "You will go back to your belt," Lur said, trying to make it not a question. "I go where the contracts go," he said. "You will not come to the Protectorate then," she said, light like a hand that knew not to grip too tightly. He met her gaze. "Didn't say that." Sarah stepped in from the corridor as if she had been listening. Maybe she had. "We have pirates to break," she said, "and officers to shame for not getting there first, and a ceremony that will make you itch." "I'm good at itching," he said. She folded her big hands that had held his life steady on a small medical bed while the universe decided what it thought of him. "I cannot give you back what you spent," she said. "I can only promise that we will spend what you gave us." "Spend it well," he said. They dropped into Protectorate space like a stone into a still lake, rings of protocol rippling outward. Cassian expected to feel lost. He felt, instead, a strange relief. It was the relief of being in a place where everyone had decided on the same language for courage. He rested. He healed. He learned how to walk without a shell by arguing with his muscles in a patient old man voice. Lur visited and brought him contraband sweets, and Sarah visited and told him stories of the storms the Protectorate had been built to stop. He told them about humans. "We fail loudly," he said. We get up noisily too. We like tools. We forgive grudges, but not easily. We carry our dead with us like books we keep opening. We confuse kindness for weakness and then remember. We learn and then we pretend we always knew. We're messy, but we keep going. Sarah listened with the care of a strategist. Lur listened with the open face of a student who had found the subject she would study all her life. When Cassian could stand without seeing stars that weren't there, Sarah brought him to a window that looked out on the Protectorate fleet. Ships sat in their berths like quiet knives. "You know why I stayed on top of you," she said. "On that bed it was physics. Any medic would have done so." "Not any," he said quietly. "Most worth knowing," she countered. "But there was another reason. I wanted you to wake to someone above you who wasn't an enemy. I wanted your instinct to be trust." He swallowed, felt the thinness inside his throat, and kept his voice even. "It was." She nodded, as if that ticked a box on a form in her mind. "Then we have done one good thing." The fleet used them the way big organizations use small miracles, with calculations and press releases, and a quiet undercurrent of gratitude that rarely reaches paper. They moved on the freeborn with the speed of pent fury and the slowness of bureaucracy. The captain they left tied to a rock told everything there was to tell and invented some more. Most of it was true. The part about the refinery being a test was true enough to hurt. "Test," Cassian repeated, hating the way the word tasted. "They wanted to see who would answer," Sarah said. "They wanted to measure the time between a human outpost's distress and the arrival of law. They wanted to find the soft places." He thought of the miner's hymn under a stone. He thought of the kettle's steam and the names scratched into caves that didn't make a sound for centuries. "We're soft," he said, "and hard. Depends on where you press." Lur smiled at that like toast too near a fire, a little scorched, a little sweet. They went back to the moon, not because revenge demanded it, though it had a voice, but because the survivors had to walk in through a door and be greeted by a room that looked like itself again. Humans do not heal by forgetting. They heal by returning. Sarah knew it. Lur learned it. Cassian felt it like a gentler weight than the one she had laid on his chest. They rebuilt. They named a walkway for the two miners who had not made it out. They let the cook run the kitchen the way he'd always wanted to. They put the shrines back, but newer, and wrote the hymns again with neater words. They hung a rough sketch in the camp mess of a human too thin to be a hero and a Vaeryn commander built like a mountain, both holding a line that had no end. The story went out on the Protectorate currents and found the human trajectories too. It did what Sarah had asked. It made a beacon. It made certain men do math and find themselves too small to answer it. Cassian didn't leave. He found that contracts kept arriving with the exact names of the things he now wanted to do. Help this settlement fix its shields. Teach these kids how to spot a loading rig about to fail. Travel with Lur on a survey of border outposts and tell the miners how he had seen a Vaeryn commander hold a life on a table and refuse to give it back up. He slept better, not easier. Better the way a man sleeps after a day of honest work. One stuttering blue night, months after, a different kind of ship ghosted in low. It wore no flag, which was its own flag. It didn't land. It sent a thin line of light to paint the ridge. Cassian and Lur were in the mess, arguing about whether the stew needed more of the green spice that turned your ears numb and made you grin. The camp quieted like an animal pricking its ears. Sarah walked in, made eye contact with Cassian, and nodded toward the ridge with a seriousness that tasted like old promises coming due. They went with a dozen others. Up beyond the last light they found a figure standing, shadow shaped like a human in a long coat. He turned. The lamps caught a face Cassian knew only a little from that fast fight on the gangway, the captain. Older by a problem, thinner by a consequence. He had no weapon visible. The patrol Auks had their weapons visible anyway. "I came to make a trade," he said, his voice hoarser but still too sure of itself. He looked at Cassian and didn't bother to pretend the past didn't stand between them like a wall that had been torn down and used to build something else. I came, the captain continued, to trade information for a story. Sarah stepped forward. We do not pay for tales with our throats. Not your throat, he said, his. He nodded at Cassian. I want to know what a human thinks about what we did. That's not a trade, Lur snapped, young, angled, protective. It is, the captain said, and he lifted a small device and set it on the ground. It unfolded like origami, and the projection that climbed out of it was ugly. Coordinates, a list of shipments, a map of routes used by freeborn who had decided open war was the wrong color but didn't mind the taste of bleeding. Use it, and you will hurt us, the captain said. Use it, and I will be hunted by my kind, so I will make the last thing that I do be the right thing if you give me something that makes sense of the first things I did. He looked at Cassian. Why did you go back for the girl? Cassian surprised himself. He thought the answer would be the same one he had given Lur, simple and deflecting. Instead, something else came out. Because if she had been human, he said, no one would have asked. The captain's mouth twitched like pain had taught it a joke it didn't appreciate. That's it. That's everything, Cassian said. You step over smaller lives and find your boot lighter. You do it often enough and you forget what your feet are for. The captain closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were raw as old wounds. He nodded. Take it, he said, and he walked down the far side of the ridge and into a night that had not decided what to do with him. They rooted the freeborn out of the routes the device named. They lost people doing it. They put names under stones and then on walls. Humans came to respect the Vaeryn way of marching in fours. Vaeryn learned the human way of drinking in threes while telling a story that made everything hurt less. When debriefs turned into dinners and ceremonies turned into quiet mentions in a clipboard that meant money for a settlement or fuel for a ship, Cassian found himself on a platform in a protectorate hall lined with flags that represented choices. The hall was full. Sarah stood to one side like a promise kept. Lur stood to the other like a promise made. They expected a speech. He wasn't much for speeches, so he told them the smallest story. A man with a pry bar, he said, and a girl with a uniform too new. A mountain of a woman who refused physics its victory fee. A cave that kept a kettle, and a bomb that wanted to meet people and was denied. That's all. No prophecy, no destiny, just people who didn't move when the easy thing told them to. The hall breathed. He didn't fill the silence. He let the silence fill them. Afterward, Sarah found him in the corridor. The doctors tell me you will have scars, she said. I keep mine, he said. We do not hide ours either, she answered. We call them grammar. They give meaning to the sentences we write later. He touched his side where the memory of the mountain's hands lived. I owe you my life. We owe you our girl, she said. And the story. Stories are more expensive than people think. When Cassian woke in the small guest room they gave him, early light slanting in a pattern that made him think of the belt in winter, he remembered the refinery's first shot and the way it had stripped choice. He remembered the space between heartbeats when Sarah had told his body, sternly, to keep being. He had gotten up each day since and chosen to keep being. On a day when the weather was clear and the fleet was a silent architecture at the edge of vision, Cassian and Lur climbed a tower that looked like a spear turned into a reminder. They looked out where stars kept their secrets. Lur leaned on the rail beside him and said a thing she had been holding like coals in her hands. Stay. He didn't say yes immediately. That would have insulted the weight of the way she asked. He turned the word in his mouth the way miners turn a new vein in their minds. I can stay, he said. She smiled. It wasn't the relief of someone who had feared. It was the acceptance of someone who had built a place, plank by plank, for a thing that might come, and now it had. They descended to the square where people moved in the ordinary ways that save the world. Sarah met them, looked once, and nodded as if a small strategy had gone right. Cassian looked at both of them and found that his heart, which had been a soldier all its life, had finally been allowed to become a citizen. The freeborn didn't vanish. Nothing like that ever finishes itself. There were still alarms and weapons and ships that thought they were smarter than whoever built them. There were still funerals. There were weddings too, and recipes learned and names given, and 100 small customs traded like gifts, until it was hard to tell which belonged to which people and no one cared. The mining camp on the wounded moon rebuilt into something that didn't know how to be afraid of itself anymore. The refinery sang again. The catwalk where Cassian had shouted and bled carried new boots. The little shrine in the cave got crowded. The miners added a line to the old hymn about a human and a Vaeryn, and the way two people had turned a canyon into a bell that rang for a whole galaxy. They sang it quietly, but the sound carried. Stories dissolve wars. They do it slowly and with more backsliding than anyone likes to admit. But sometimes they burn bright enough that even men who think they are the center of the universe have to squint and look away, and in the looking away, find they have walked somewhere better by accident. One night, because nights still come even to the brave Cassian, dreamed of the refinery again. He felt the weight. He woke and found a hand on his chest, light as a promise. Sarah had stopped by, late from some duty. She sat in the chair by his bed and watched him wake. "Still here?" he asked. "Still," she said. He covered her hand with his. The mountain allowed it. "I did not save you," she said after a while. "I kept you from dying long enough to save yourself." He shook his head. "That's what saving is." She hummed, a sound like an engine warming. "You are not wrong," she permitted. Outside, a new day ran its hands over the ships and the stones and found them good enough to try again. Inside, a human who had done an ordinary thing as loudly as he could breathed in. He breathed out. Headphone, if you're enjoying this story, take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps keep humanity's stories alive among the stars. The next crisis came dressed in a diplomat's robe. It arrived with seals and stamps and a procession of well-meaning faces. The Protectorate Parliament had opinions about jurisdiction and the freeborn's sudden interest in appearing civilized. The belt trade houses had interests too, ores and contracts, and the polite language of profit that could be arranged to sound like concern if you tuned your ear to hear it. They named a conference. They chose a neutral platform, Station Kel 3, a ring around a cold planet with a view that made anyone feel both large and small the way good views do. Sarah was ordered to attend. Lur was assigned as liaison because she had been present at the wrong things and therefore knew the right answers. Cassian came because another set of eyes that didn't belong to a uniform made everybody else tell the truth more often than not. They stepped from the shuttle into a corridor polished to the kind of shine that spends money. The air smelled like citrus and paper promises. The guards smiled with the careful teeth of men who had practiced smiling in mirrors. The rooms were too big to whisper in comfortably, so people used their big voices and filled them with important-sounding nothing. It would have been dangerous even if the freeborn hadn't decided to attend. They came in their new clothes, no ragged coats, no skulls. The captain was not among them. Cassian wondered where he had walked to and if he had found something he could live with when he got there. The freeborn delegates wore pins with a simple emblem, a broken chain mended. It made a statement the way a magician makes a coin appear. Sarah ignored it. Lur scowled at it honestly. Cassian thought about all the times he had fixed a thing and pretended the fixing didn't leave a line anyone could see. They put him at the end of a long table because there were not enough chairs for all the importance in the room. Sarah sat near the middle like a new pillar in a building that had thought itself complete. Lur took notes with a stylus that clicked when her temper spiked. The freeborn spoke first, smooth as oil. They apologized with the kind of apology that never touched bone. They conceded routes and promised police powers that would be funded just as soon as a committee that had never met would meet. They were patient because patience is cheap and sounds expensive. When it was Sarah's turn, she didn't make pretty. "You waited," she said, "while our people bled. You came when a story made you look slow for not coming. Now you want to buy time with words. Time is not for sale. The chair of the session cut in with a gavel that made a sound like a nervous cough. Commander, we must strive for decorum. Decorum is how violence arranges its cutlery, Sarah said, and if anyone else had said it, they would have been escorted out. No one escorted mountains. Cassian watched the freeborn. Their faces were masks. Masks crack under heat. He shifted in his seat to add heat. He spoke from the end of the table where voices go to die and made his carry. You want to talk like it happened to people you don't know, he said, but you know us now. He told the smallest story again. This time he didn't say bomb, he said a device. He didn't say blood in the corridor. He said loss and let each person in the room load the word with their own cargo until their shoulders sagged under it a little. And we're still here, he finished. We will still be here when the ink dries, when the ink is washed away, when the names change. I'm not telling you to be good. I'm telling you we will outlast your bad. Silence followed with the obedient steps of a servant. The chair wanted badly to gavel it away and did not. He was not a bad man. He was a tired one. He recognized the shape of a turning moment. He let it turn. After, Cassian found the freeborn envoy in a corridor that smelled like coffee and compromise. The envoy was younger than the piracy, older than the best excuses. He paused when Cassian paused in a choreography as old as conflict. You dug us out, the envoy said. You dug us out with a pry bar and a story, and now we have to stand in the light and learn to like it. Cassian shrugged carefully to keep the scar from reminding him what it used to be. You can go back in the ground, he said. Some do, but the ground gets colder every year. The envoy nodded, and in that nod was a blueprint for either peace or the kind of war that starts small and eats its own tail. A week into negotiations, someone tried to end the story in a kitchen with a knife and a poison that smelled like lilies. They didn't count on the way humans have evolved to notice lilies in the wrong room. The assassin died with a bewildered look because he had been told that human reflexes were slow. He was wrong. He was also wrong about Vaeryn commanders needing 2 hands to break a man's arm. After the attempt, Station Kel 3 grew eyes. The quiet kind. Sarah spoke to fewer people and watched more. Lur stayed between Cassian and dangerous corners like it was a game she meant to win. Cassian slept with an alarm woven into the rhythm of the lights. The captain came on the last day. He walked through the main hall without a weapon, hands open, and everyone who had ever carried a weapon understood what it cost him to do that. He stopped 10 paces from Sarah and bowed in a freeborn way that had been taken from another culture and recut to fit. I have no right to be here, he said. You do not, Sarah agreed. Then I will earn the right by leaving something, he said, and placed on the floor a metal box like the one that had once sung to Cassian's bones. This one was muted and made other kinds of music. He opened it and a roomful of secrets rose and arranged themselves in the air. Ships, codes, names, not a trinket, a treasure. What do you want for this? The chair asked, stepping forward because sometimes men like him had to be important at the right moment. The captain looked at Cassian. I want him to say my name when he tells the story, not my freeborn name, the old one. The one my mother gave me before I forgot what it meant. Cassian nodded. It cost him nothing and cost the captain a past. He took the cost. Ilium, he said, and the sound turned the air in the hall into something not entirely safe for lies. The captain closed his eyes like a wound, laughed, and then healed a little. He handed the box to Sarah. He left the hall. He kept walking. No one followed. Sometimes the right thing to do is go away. The conference ended with signatures that looked at a distance, like roads drawn onto a map that had learned where bridges could bear and where they could not. The Protectorate went home with a victory it didn't celebrate loudly. The Freeborn went home with a debt that would call them at strange hours. The belt houses made noises about cooperation, which is how people who count coins say a prayer. Cassian, and Sarah returned to the moon by a different route than they had left it. The camp cheered because cheering is how small places tell themselves big news. Kids ran with home-built models of Vaeryn ships. Miners made jokes about belt safety protocols and then followed them anyway. The cook put too much green spice in the stew and watched, delighted, as everyone's ears went numb and their laughter turned into a melody. Life reasserted itself the way it always does when given the slightest excuse. On a clear evening that gave the canyon a gentleness it did not usually bother with, Cassian walked the catwalk where it had begun. He put his hand on the rail and felt the place in the metal where his blood had once dried and now was only a story rubbed smooth by hands that wanted to touch it. Lur joined him. They watched the light do what light does. "You saved me," she said, though they both knew it wasn't simple enough for that. "You saved me back," he said, and it balanced the sentence. She leaned her shoulder against his, not heavy, enough. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The choice, the pry bar, the way one moment turns your life into a road you can't leave without breaking something important." He let the thought sit in him the way good food sits. "I regret the shots," he said, blunt. "I regret that people like Liam keep proving they're better and worse in the same breath. I regret the funerals, but the choice." He shook his head. "No, I regret most of the things I didn't do. I have never regretted the ones that made me larger." "You are not large," she said, laughing softly. "I contain multitudes," he said solemnly, and she elbowed him, and he pretended it hurt more than it did. Sarah's voice came across the comm with a tone he had learned meant trouble that would become a story if they lived. "We have a freighter on approach," she said. "It is not broadcasting. It is also on fire." "Can they land?" Lur asked. "If we flatten gravity and lie to physics," Sarah said. "We know someone who is very good at telling lies to physics," Lur said, and she and Cassian ran because sometimes the only plot is motion. They brought the freighter in crooked and trembling. The pilot's voice was a wire pulled too tight. The hull smeared itself on the air the way a sky does when it wants to be ground. The miners grabbed lines. The kids threw sand on sparks with very serious faces. Sarah stood under the belly of a thing that weighed mountains and decided she would hold it anyway. Cassian found the old handles inside himself, the ones labeled leverage and counterforce and not today. He pulled them in sequence and watched an impossible machine agree to behave. It landed. The doors opened. Oxygen burnt and joy grabbed it in handfuls anyway. People stumbled out with the look of those who have visited a possible future and voted no. They were human and Vaeryn and two other species that had only names here. They collapsed onto a floor that was more promise than plan. They were welcomed in a way that said, clearly, "This place makes room." That night the stars did the slow wheel that makes even brave hearts a little quiet. They all sat around a fire that the station would have frowned on. They told the smallest story again and added a freighter to it, and a kitchen knife that had missed, and a man named Liam who had asked for his mother's name to be spoken. Later, when the flames were blue and the guitars were tired, Cassian leaned back and watched smoke draw lines across the night. He thought about how many people had their hands on him that day in the refinery. Lur's, Sarah's, even the raiders in the split second before he hit. He thought about all the hands on him now, literal and metaphor, the kind of weight you carry with pride. He smiled because sometimes a scar itches and that's the body saying, "We healed." When sleep came, it came like a truce. When morning came, it looked at the moon and decided to stay. When work came, it found them ready and made a list they were happy to cross off. And if, sometimes, Cassian woke with the memory of a mountain pinning him to life, he would reach up and find that hand still there in the form of friendship and duty and the kind of love you don't have to name to keep. He would breathe, and the breath would move into a world that had learned his shape and kept it. He had been shot 7 times. He had saved a girl from a species that started out as a word and became family. He had woken under a weight that had been safety, not threat. He had carried that lesson forward the way humans carry fire, careful, bright, hard to put out. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.